We got a stack of budget graphics cards on the table. Gears 5 just released earlier this week. I think you know where this is going. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome to Zach's Tech Turf. Today we're going to be benchmarking hands down my absolute favorite new benchmarking game on the planet right now, Gears 5 with some budget graphics cards. And if you're new here and you want to see other benchmarking videos just like this one, then hit that subscribe button down below and also the notification bell. That way you never miss an episode. But yeah, let's get into it. Before we get into why I think this is the best new benchmarking game in the world, for today's testing I have 7 budget graphics cards plus the 3400G's integrated graphics, and these are all the same ones that I've been featuring in a ton of other benchmarking videos. For the AMD side of things, we have the RX 570 and the RX 480, and over on the NVIDIA side we have the GTX 750 Ti, which I will phase out here soon. We also have the GTX 960, GTX 970, GTX 1050 Ti, and finally the GTX 1060. I usually have the RX 460 for these videos, but it literally just died on me, so I ended up buying both an RX 560 and an RX 580 because we're about to see a lot of new benchmarking worthy titles. For our testing platform, we're actually using a new benchmarking rig that I just built, and huge thanks to Be Quiet for sending over this massive Dark-Base 900 Pro Rev 2 case, which is perfect because I have a ton of room to swap parts in and out, and they also sent me the silent 600 watt power supply that's underneath the shroud. Other than that, this testing rig is rocking a Ryzen 5 3400G, which I think is a good combination for most of these GPUs. Plus I got another thing to benchmark with the integrated graphics. The motherboard is an MSI X570A Pro with the latest BIOS update, 16GB of Team Group 3000 MHz DDR4 RAM, and the game is installed on a 120GB AirI SSD. Booting into the actual game, here's where we quickly start to see why I love this game for testing so much. Just looking at this really quickly, there's a ton of video options that us PC gamers really love, but if you highlight over them, it'll actually show you how much it impacts each component. Very cool feature in my opinion. While we're on this page here, you'll also notice that you can set a target minimum FPS, and this is because Gears 5 uses a dynamic resolution system, which is definitely worth talking about. In a nutshell, dynamic resolution allows you to pick a target FPS mark, let's say 60 for most of us, and then this tells the game to automatically shift the resolution scale while you're playing the game to maintain that 60 FPS. If you turn this setting off, then the settings in the resolution scale will remain the exact same while gaming, meaning that if you get into a situation with a ton of monsters in front of you, for example, you may experience lower frame rates. With dynamic resolution turned on though, instead of the FPS lowering, the actual quality of the graphics will lower, and some of you may or may not like this. I tested this out for myself, and right now you're watching some footage of using the GTX 750 Ti with 1080p and medium settings with dynamic resolution turned on. I wasn't quite getting my target 60 FPS mark, but I was still averaging a decent 45 FPS. The thing about this though is that I wasn't seeing true 1080p in medium settings. The game had to really drop the quality of the settings to achieve this higher FPS, because once I turned dynamic resolution off, the game was only averaging like 30 FPS. Granted, the graphics with this 30 FPS looked much better, but yeah, hopefully that made sense. For today's testing, I'm going to show you the settings with the fancy charts with the dynamic resolution setting turned off for all of these graphics cards. That way you can truly see what kind of performance these GPUs will push out. Just in case you're interested, I'll also quickly mention what the FPS was when you turn on that target FPS up to 60. Just remember, when you do that, you're not getting the full quality of the settings that you choose. Also, just so you know, for today's testing, I'm only going to be benchmarking these cards with the presets low, medium, high, and ultra, but just know that you can definitely tweak these a little bit more in depth to your liking, and if you're interested in that, I would highly recommend checking out Hardware Unboxed video that you can check out up here. For the actual benchmarking run, the developers of Gears 5 were baller enough to supply us with a built-in benchmarking tool, so that's what I'll be using today, of course. Another feature that I absolutely love is how much info you get after running the benchmarks, as you can see here. On this page, you can see how much VRAM and RAM was used, which graphics settings you were using, how much the GPU was bound, and it even plots the data for you. Absolutely awesome in my book. And finally, moving on to the actual benchmarking results, here's a chart with all of the GPUs running the exact same settings, 1080p and low. As you can see, every card on our list is at least playable in 1080p and low, and all of these GPUs look like they scaled properly, but the 2GB cards did struggle a bit more than the 4GB cards for sure. Now it's time for the individual benchmarks, and just like I said earlier, I'm going to show you the results that you'll get with all of these graphics cards with dynamic resolution resolution turned off and just the preset settings, but then I'll quickly mention how much FPS you would get if you turned on dynamic resolution. The first card up was the 8GB RX 570. Once again, sorry for not having the 460 or 560 for this video, and with this card I could put the settings at 1080p and high and got a solid FPS average of 66. With dynamic resolution turned on, I averaged only one higher at 67 FPS, and that's just because the settings didn't have to change too much to maintain that 60 FPS target. Following that, for our only other AMD card for the day, the 8GB RX 480 was up next, and also in 1080p and high settings I got slightly higher results with an FPS average of 70. Just like the 570, when I turned on the dynamic resolution I only got 1 FPS higher than without it. Getting into our NVIDIA cards, the first one up was the super budget GTX 750 Ti, and in 1080p and low settings I only averaged 44. This is definitely playable, but once you turn on dynamic resolution I maintain exactly right on the target with 60 FPS, so that's probably what I recommend you do with this card. After that I tested out our other 2GB card, the GTX 960, and also in 1080p and low settings I averaged 58 FPS. Once I turned on the dynamic settings I got slightly higher with 63 frames per second. Following that was still my favorite budget GPU for the money here in 2019, the GTX 970 of course, and in 1080p I could push the settings up to high and I averaged 60 frames per second, also got 64 frames per second with dynamic resolution turned on. After that I tested the GTX 1050 Ti with 4GB of VRAM, and in 1080p and medium settings I averaged 51 FPS. This is certainly good enough for most people, but with dynamic resolution turned on you'll get an even better 62 frames per second. And finally for our last GPU, the GTX 1060 3GB model followed up next, and in 1080p and high settings I averaged right on the money at 60 FPS and 64 with dynamic resolution turned on. For our last benchmark of the video, the 3400G with its integrated graphics followed up next, and for this one I had to drop the resolution down to 900p, and in low settings with that I still got a pretty respectable and playable 53 frames per second. That jumped up to 62 with dynamic resolution turned on. So there you have it, those are the results for Gears 5 with some budget graphics cards. Like I said, this is my absolute favorite game for benchmarking now, and I'm just letting you know that you're gonna see this in all of my upcoming build guides for benchmarking for probably the next few years. Well, there you have it, that's gonna wrap up my benchmarks for Gears 5. As always, drop a comment down below about what results you got with Gears 5, because maybe you'll help out someone in the comment section that doesn't have one of these GPUs. After that, feel free to head on over to one of these two videos if you haven't seen them yet, and definitely hit that subscribe button, because coming up next, we gotta do this all over again with Borderlands 3. You don't want to miss that video.